Hello and welcome to another full step-by-step PC build guide, and today I'm going to be showing you how to build a PC in Lian Li's Q58. Now, as you can probably tell from the size of this case at only 14.5 litres, this is going to be a mini ITX build, and you're probably wondering how I'm going to fit all these parts into such a small case, but trust me, they will fit. The Q58 is available in two different colours, black and white, and each of those colours in two different versions, with a Gen 3 riser cable and with a Gen 4 riser cable. So today I've got the black version with the Gen 4 riser cable. Taking a look at the other parts I've chosen for today's build. For the motherboard, I've got the ASUS ROG STRIX Z690 iGaming Wi-Fi. For the CPU, I'm going to be using Intel's 12th Gen i7 12700K. Keeping our CPU cool, I've got a 240mm AIO from Cooler Master. It's their MasterLiquid ML240 mirror. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Kingston Beast DDR5 at 5200 MHz. For storage, our motherboard will accommodate up to two Gen 4 M.2 SSDs, and that's exactly what I'm going to be installing. For the boot drive, I'm going to be using the Samsung 980 Pro in 250GB capacity, and for additional storage, I'm going to be using the Sabrent Rocket 4 Plus in 2TB capacity. The Q58 will accommodate up to 4 SATA drives, although with over 2TB of storage in our M.2 drives, you can make an argument that we don't actually need any additional storage. However, Lian Li have done something really cool with one of the SATA mounting drive locations in this case, so that's the reason I've selected a SATA drive. So the drive I've got is from Kingston. It's their KC600 in 500GB capacity. Powering the whole build, I've got an SFX power supply from SilverStone. It's the SX750. For the graphics card, I'm going to be using the AORUS Master RTX 3070. For case fans, I've got a triple pack of BQuad's light wings in 120mm size. Okay, that's all the parts. Let's get on with the build. To remove the top panel, we need to loosen the middle thumb screw at the back, and then it simply just pushes up and can be lifted away. On both sides of the case, we've got two doors. By default at the bottom, we've got a mesh panel, and at the top, a tempered glass, but these can be changed round. To open them up, all we need to do is simply pull them down and up. The mesh panels are slightly easier to remove. All you need to do is pull them to the side and they can be lifted away. To avoid the tempered glass doors falling off and breaking, there's a little thumb screw at the back which we need to loosen before the door can be removed. With the thumb screw removed, we can simply slide the door backwards. It's exactly the same story on the other side. Open the door, pull it backwards and lift away. One of the nice things about the case is it is completely configurable. So if you want to have all mesh on one side, that's no problem. We'll take our two mesh panels, slide them on. So if you want, you can have all mesh on one side, all glass on the other, or if you want to reverse the order and have the mesh at the top and the glass at the bottom, you can do that. So giving you a quick orientation in the case, our motherboard is going to go here, and it's going to be inverted upside down, and then we've got our riser cable which is going to plug into the PCIe slot. We've got a bracket here for our power supply. Our radiator is going to go at the top on this bracket. And then taking a look at the other side, this is where our GPU is going to mount. You can see we've got our PCIe slots at the back and we've got our riser cable ending here. Taking a look at the front I/O, we've got a single USB Type A and Type C connector. We've got a combined headphone and microphone jack and a power button. The front panel simply pulls off from the front. On the top of the case, we've got a removable fan stroke radiator bracket where you can fit up to two 140 or two 120mm fans, or either a 280 or 240mm radiator. If you do want to use a 280mm radiator, you're going to have to install the fans at the top with the radiator down below it. If you're using a 240, you can do it either way. In the accessory box, you've got this additional bracket which can be installed at the top. It's got mounting holes for installing either a 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch SATA drive. Then you would simply just mount it to the top bracket. You can probably already guess the downside of this, and this is that you are halving the space you have for a radiator and fans at the top of the case. So you would be limited to a 120mm AIO on one side, And there is 3 other mounting locations in the case for a 2.5-inch drive. Particularly when you consider the CPU cooler height in this case is only 67mm, which is really going to limit what you can do with air cooling. I would strongly recommend not installing this bracket at the top, because that is going to significantly hamper the cooling in this case. You're going to want at least a 240 or a 280mm radiator at the top of the case in terms of cooling. The bracket at the top of the case is held on with 4 screws, 2 on each side. With the 4 screws removed, the bracket can simply be lifted off from the top. In the accessory box, we've got 2 magnetic dust filters for the bottom of the case. The panel on this side is removable, so we'll go ahead and loosen up the thumb screw. And then we can slide the panel to the side and lift away. So if we take a look at the panel that we have just removed, you've got 2 mounting options for this panel. You can either mount a 120mm fan, or you can mount another 2.5-inch drive. Again, another nice feature of this, being able to remove this panel, is you now have access to the bottom of the case, particularly for managing the cables coming from the power supply. The power supply bracket is removable. I'm going to show you how to remove it, although depending on how you're planning to build in the case, you may not need to remove it, and you can simply insert your power supply in and screw it in from the top. Reasons you may want to remove it: 1, there's an additional 2.5-inch drive mount behind the bracket, so you may need to remove it to install that. Or the other thing, there is actually a separate bracket that lets you go with a full-sized ATX power supply, and if you're going to do that, you're going to have to remove this. So we're going to need to remove this screw on the front of the case, and then there's 4 screws on the back to remove. You'll notice now with the 5 screws removed, the SFX power supply bracket is completely free. It's only attached by the cable attached to the side, so we just need to free up the cable and then we can remove the bracket. So you now can see the additional SSD mounting location I was talking about, which is going to be sandwiched in between this panel and our power supply bracket. The other important thing to point out is we've got 2 sets of holes for mounting our SFX power supply bracket. If you've got an SFX power supply, they recommend you use the bottom holes. If you've got an SFXL power supply, you should use the top holes when mounting the bracket. The other additional accessory I want to show you is an optional top panel that allows you to mount a full-sized ATX power supply. So we just simply need to slide this in at the top. You can already see the downside of this. Again, similar to mounting an SSD or hard drive at the top of the case, is you are now limiting your space for cooling. Your power supply is going to be mounted on this side. I'll show you what that looks like. And when you first look at it, you might think this looks like a great idea. It's going to save you some money getting a full-sized ATX power supply instead of an SFX power supply. But as you can see, the big problem with doing this is we are now limited to cooling with either 120mm AIO or an air cooler of less than 67mm in height, both of which are not a good idea, when with the other bracket at the top of the case, you can either have a 240 or a 280mm radiator. So I'm going to go ahead and remove this, put this back in the box, which is where I suggest you leave it. So a really cool feature of this case, if we open up this little door here, the case comes with an included ARGB and PWM fan hubs. So we've got three pin 5V ARGB connectors and 3 4-pin PWM fan connectors, which is brilliant for an ITX case because normally the motherboards have quite few headers compared to the bigger motherboards. So we've got 1 cable for ARGB, 1 cable for PWM you're going to have to plug into your motherboard, and you're going to be able to control 3 fans using the built-in hub. And the door is held on with a magnet, so we can simply close it and it holds it in place. So now we come on to the case's 4th and most exciting SSD mounting option. So I've got my 2.5-inch SATA drive, and to install it, all I need to do is slot it into the front and push. Coming from the drive mounting location, we've already got a SATA power connector and SATA data connector already plugged in, so that is the SSD installed. Final thing to mention about the case is the support for graphics cards. So graphics cards up to a maximum length of 320mm are supported. We're now ready to start working the motherboard, and the first thing I want to do is install our CPU. So I'm just going to push down on this lever to open it up and lift up here. I'm just going to set our CPU into the socket. There's 2 little notches on the bottom which line up with the socket, and you see the text is facing the correct way up. Then if we close the lever here, apply a little bit of pressure, this little bit of plastic will pop off. And then we can go ahead and close the lever and secure things into place. Next, I want to install the bracket for our CPU cooler. If you look in each corner, you'll notice we actually have two mounting holes. One is for the new LGA 1700 standard, while one of the nice things ASUS are doing is they've also included mounting holes for LGA 1200. And this is actually really useful because the AIO that I'm using, I don't have the new mounting bracket for. So I'm going to use the old LGA 1200 mounting bracket. So we can insert the back plate through the back of the motherboard. And then we've got one of these standoffs to screw onto each corner. To install our M.2 SSDs, we're going to need to remove the heat sinks. So this is our top socket. Our second socket is beneath this, so we're going to need to remove these two screws. We just need to free up this cable. And then we should simply be able to lift this off. We can remove the plastic protection, insert our drive into the socket, flatten it down, and then we've got this little clip here which we can close, and that's going to hold our drive into place. We've got more plastic protection on the other side to remove, and then we can return this next level, lining up the screws, and then pushing down here to make contact, and then we'll tighten up the screws again and then replace this cable. Again, with more plastic protection to remove, we can insert our second drive into the slot, flatten it down, and again close the clip. Again, we want to remove the plastic protection from the back of the heatsink. Then we can replace the heatsink and secure it into place. We're ready to install our RAM, so I'm going to open the clip on both slots. I'm then going to line the RAM up with the slot. Once I'm happy everything is lined up, I'm going to apply some firm pressure to the top of the RAM and it's going to clip into place. Same thing with our second stick. And again, some firm pressure and the RAM is going to lock into place. Just before we put the motherboard in the case, we're going to have to add in this additional card. It just clips into place here, and it contains the SATA ports for the motherboard as well as some additional connectors. We can set our motherboard into the case, lining it up with a cutout at the back, and then get the motherboard secured into place with the 4 screws from the accessory bag. Next thing to do is get our case cables plugged in. So our HD audio cable is going to go into this header here. Then we've got the RGB connector coming from our fan hub. It goes into this header here. The PWM cable coming from our fan hub, I'm going to plug into our CPU fan header, which is at the top of the motherboard. So that cable wasn't the easiest to plug in. What I would probably recommend doing is actually plugging it in before you install the motherboard. Then we've got our USB cables. I'm going to start by plugging our Type-C connector into here, our USB 3.0 cable into here. We've got our power switch, which is going to go into this add-in card here. And then we've got our SATA data cable, which I'm going to plug into here. Next, we want to plug in our riser cable. So I'm going to open the slot on the motherboard, remove the protective covering, get things lined up with our slot. And once we're happy things are lined up, we can go ahead and push into place. This is our SFX power supply, and I've already gone ahead and plugged in the cables we're going to need. So we've got a 24-pin connector, a single 8-pin EPS cable, a single PCIe cable. It has 2 8-pin connectors, which is what we're going to need for our graphics card, and I've also plugged in a SATA power cable. We can set our power supply onto its bracket and then secure it into place with the screws from the accessory box. Just before we set our power supply into the case, we're going to want to route our PCIe cable up behind the power supply. We can then go ahead and slot our power supply into the case. You'll also notice I've taken the opportunity to route some of our spare cables behind the power supply, helping hold them out of the way. And then we can secure the power supply into place with the same 5 screws from earlier on. Now I am going to secure the power supply in the higher position because I would be keen to install a fan down below it if I can. Then we can plug our 8-pin EPS cable in the top right hand side of the motherboard. We can plug in our motherboard's 24-pin cable. We can connect the SATA power cable coming from our drive into the power supply cable. And then we can connect our power supply extension cable into the top of our power supply, and importantly make sure the power supply button is turned to on. I'm going to start with a little bit of cable management, so I'm going to pass as much of our cables as I can up into this space behind the power supply. Then I'm going to use the Velcro straps to manage the rest of our cables down the side of our power supply. Next we can set our bottom fan onto the bracket, and I'm going to have it set to intake. And then we'll get it secured into place using the included fan screws. We can pass our fan cables into the main body of the case, slide our bottom fan into place, and secure it into place at the bottom with a thumb screw. We can then add the dust filters in at the bottom. And then I'm just going to route the cables up to the top. Again, we'll just use the Velcro straps to tidy them up. Then we can open the door to the hub. We'll plug into LED number 1 and also PWM header 1. Next I want to install our GPU, so we're going to need to remove the first and second slot cover. Then we need to open the clip on our expansion cable. Insert our graphics card into the case. Go ahead and line it up with the slot. Once we're happy everything's lined up, we can apply a bit of firm pressure and the card is going to slot into place. We can then secure the graphics card into place with the 2 screws we removed earlier on. Then we can plug in our 8-pin PCIe cables. And then we'll tuck the excess cable through to the back. Now we can go ahead and set our fans onto our radiator. Now, as I mentioned, I'm using the Be Quiet Light Wings fans, both as case fans and radiator fans. The AIO does come with fans, so you're perfectly fine just using them. They don't have any RGB on them, and the only difference in installing them is you won't have any RGB to connect up. The reason I'm installing these is most of the fans, what you're going to see is actually the side, and these have quite a nice thick ring of light at the side. I've not used these before in a build, so I'm just keen to test them out. So we can secure our fans to the radiator using the long radiator screws. Next we can set our case's top bracket onto the radiator, and then we'll secure it in place with the short radiator screws. We're now ready to set our top bracket into place, so we'll go ahead and bring the pump through. Pass all our fan cables through, and then lower the bracket down into place. Next I just want to plug in the 3-pin connector to the AIO header on the motherboard. Then I'm going to apply a pea-sized amount of thermal paste to the centre of the CPU. Then we can lower our AIO down into place, and we'll secure it with a thumb screw on each corner. I'm just going to tuck the pump cable down at the bottom out of the way, and then I'm going to pass our RGB cable up towards the top of the motherboard. I'm then going to pass our tubes over to the side, and then I've got another Velcro cable strap which I'm going to use to help manage them. Then we've got the fans in our AIO to get plugged in, so I'm going to bring our two PWM fans through and get them plugged into the headers. Then we'll bring our two ARGB connectors through. The last cable for us to plug in is the ARGB connector coming from our pump. So fortunately the fans do have an additional splitter cable, so all we need to do is line them up and push into place. Last thing to do is just tidy up all these cables coming from our AIO, and I'm just going to use a cable tie to tidy them in here up where the fan hub is. So that's the build complete, and I think you'll agree it looks great. I've gone ahead and set the PC up. I haven't recorded those steps because I thought my time was actually probably better spent doing some thermal testing, which I have done, and I can now tell you what is the best fan configuration for this case. The reason I haven't recorded it as well is very recently I did another full step-by-step build guide with another ASUS motherboard with exactly the same CPU, exactly the same RAM, and in fact the steps for installing Windows, installing the drivers, controlling the RGB is exactly the same as that video. So that was my first build in the Lian Li 011 Dynamic Evo, and you'll find a link to that video in the description. So let's make a start by looking at the build thermals. So before I start, I think it is important to say that the only overclocking was enabling the XMP profile on the RAM, and all the fans were running at the stock motherboard fan curves. So taking a look at the temperatures, our CPU idled at 44 degrees while it reached a maximum of 102 degrees during the 10-minute AORUS stability test, and there was significant thermal throttling during that test by up to 25%. It was the opposite story with the GPU temperatures. These were excellent, idling at 37 degrees and reaching a maximum of 67 degrees during the AORUS stability test. Noise levels were also excellent. With the PC at idle, noise was only 30 decibels, while it reached a maximum of 46 decibels during the AORUS stability test. So to put those results into context, the GPU temperatures and the idle noise levels were excellent. The noise levels under load were probably in the good to moderate range, while the CPU temperatures were not as good as I have in other builds. For example, in the P200A, when I used an air cooler, I did get very similar temperatures, a maximum of 102, with the similar levels of throttling around about 25%. However, those high temperatures were very quickly remedied by adding a 360mm AIO, and we managed to get those temperatures down to the mid-70s. Again, I used the same CPU in the Lian Li 011 Dynamic Evo and done a lot of thermal testing in that case, and in general the CPU temperatures were in the 70s with no throttling. So certainly squeezing all the components into such a small space with much fewer fans, they are going to run hotter. What is important to say is the AORUS stability test is a really extreme test. And certainly when you're using the PC for normal tasks or even using it for gaming, the temperatures are going to be nowhere near that high. They're going to be at very acceptable levels without any throttling. So going back to the best fan configuration for this case, the first thing I wanted to test was the effects of changing the fans in the radiator to intake rather than exhaust. Taking a look at the results, there was no difference to the maximum CPU temperatures under load at 102, although the thermal throttling was down by 5% to 20%. In terms of the GPU temperatures, these were significantly worse by 10 degrees, and the PC was also noisier by an additional 2 decibels under load. So the results here are fairly clear. You're going to want your fans at the top being set to exhaust. The next thing I wanted to test was how much difference did having the fan at the bottom set to intake make. So I went ahead and removed the fan and reran the thermal testing. So without the bottom intake fan, both our CPU and GPU ran 2 degrees hotter under the AORUS 64 stability test, although our PC was slightly quieter by 1 decibel. So again, the results are clear. Having the fan at the bottom is going to improve both your CPU and GPU temperatures, so I do think it is worth the effort and extra cost to install it in the case. The final thing I wanted to do was test the effects of using the stock fans that came with the IO. The light wings from Be Quiet come in 2 different versions. There's high speed ones that are designed to be used on radiators, and standard speed ones that are designed to be in case fans. Now the ones I used were the ones designed as case fans, so they mightn't have been the best fans to use on the radiator, and that might have explained their high CPU temperatures. So I wanted to rerun the test using the stock AIO fans, again in our best configuration, set to exhaust at the top with the bottom fan set to intake. So taking a look at the temperatures, there's absolutely no difference to the maximum temperature during the AORUS 64 stability test, although CPU throttling was down by 2%. The stock fans were also noisier by 2 decibels during the AORUS 64 stability test. So putting the results together, the configuration I would recommend you build in this case is exactly the one I showed you in the build guide. You're better having your fans and the radiator at the top set to exhaust, and I do think installing the fan at the bottom as intake is worth it. I really like the look of the light wings fans, so I would recommend using them on the radiator purely for the looks. Although if you want to save yourself some money, by all means use the stock fans, they perform equally well. If you are going to use the light wings fans, I would recommend getting the high speed ones to use on the radiator and the standard one at the bottom as a case fan. So as the Q58 has been out for a little while, I'm not planning on doing a separate case review, but I'll go ahead and share my thoughts on it now. So I was incredibly impressed with the case. It has excellent build quality, as you would expect coming from Lian Li, but there was quite a few really smart features in this case. In particular, I loved the hub at the back for both the fans and the ARGB. It made building it really straightforward, because had you had to use one of the bigger fan hubs or use lots of splitter cables, cable management would actually be significantly more difficult. The other thing I really liked was the SSD installation, where simply you soldered the SSD in and there was no cables to install. Although now I'm building mostly with M.2 SSDs, because you have got a smaller case and less M.2 slots on a mini ITX motherboard, it is a really useful feature to have. Again, the top removable bracket meant installing the radiator was really straightforward, and I think having the little cutout at the bottom where you could access the power supply cables was also really smart and made building in the case that little bit more easier. So in terms of building in the case, I found it really straightforward, and I think the only bit I had a little bit of trouble with was plugging in some of the cables to the top of the motherboard. So that was the 8-pin EPS cable, the fan cable going to the CPU, which was actually the cable coming from the fan hub, and also the cable for the pump, which plugged into the AIO pump header. Now, you could plug 2 of them in beforehand. You can plug the cable coming from the fan hub and the 8-pin EPS cable before you put the motherboard into the case, and I think that would be what I would recommend. Set the motherboard in loosely, plug the cables in, and then secure the motherboard. But apart from that, there wasn't really anything that was more difficult, and I think having a separate compartment for the GPU really made things that little bit easier. So putting all that together, I've been incredibly impressed with Lian Li's Q58. I've really enjoyed putting the build together in it. So if you are looking for a small form factor case and spaces of tight and limited to you, I think this is an excellent choice. If you are somebody who, however, prefers having the best temperatures, this might not be the case for you. While the GPU temperatures are exceptional, the noise levels are good, the CPU temperatures were running a little bit hotter than I would like. However, as I've already mentioned, the AORUS 64 stability test is a really extreme test, and if you're using your PC just for gaming, you will never see the temperatures that I have shown you. So like I said, it really depends what you're doing with the PC and what sort of person you are. So hopefully you find this video useful. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.